What's up, everybody? My name is Tucker. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Bradley Beal. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like rating on it. Check out my socials at the top of the screen as well. And let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I've made plenty of videos about Bradley Beal, about trade possibilities and stuff, but it's time to update it because I've said multiple times that I didn't think Bradley Beal was going to make it on the Wizards roster through this upcoming trade deadline. I thought he was either going to get dealt this offseason or during this upcoming year. And I still believe that, but there are some things, some circumstances to this that need to be talked about, that need to be discussed, because the Wizards have done a really, really good job of making Washington seem like a much more viable option for Bradley Beal's future and making it a situation he could actually see himself staying in, and that's what we're going to be talking about. First things first, I got to give the Wizards credit for really an amazing job of changing around this roster in a way that makes sense for Bradley Beal to be able to stay. First, they get out of the John Wall contract, who is arguably the worst contract in the entire league. They did it by taking on Russell Westbrook, who was also highly paid, but then they were able to flip the Westbrook thing around into not only saving them some salary, but getting back some interesting young pieces as well. And they went from Wall to Westbrook to getting assets for Westbrook to being able to sign Spencer Dinwiddie this offseason to still have a backcourt partner to pair alongside Bradley Beal. And now they've pivoted into this roster that has some veteran guys that are in their prime, tons of depth and versatility, a handful of interesting younger players that they've got to make some decisions on relatively soon, and some future salary cap flexibility as well. Not for this upcoming offseason in 2022, but for the following in 2023. And all that combines to create a situation that doesn't look nearly as bad from a future standpoint as it did just 2 off seasons ago. I mean, look at this roster. It's kind of crazy to think about where Washington was a year and a half, 2 years ago, and where they are now from a roster building standpoint. You look at this, there's not a single player on this list that is over 30 years old. You've got guys, like I said, that are veterans in their prime, guys like Montrezl Harrell that are 27, 28 years old, KCP, productive NBA players. There's really only one bad contract, in my opinion, on the entirety of this list, and that's Davis Bertans, and that's based solely off of how he played last year. If you go back to how he played 2 years ago, this contract is not a bad one for Davis Bertans. But you look at this, and they've got, the Kispert, who they just drafted, Aaron Holiday, who they traded for, Denny, who had an interesting rookie year, Rui, who I still continue to believe in and cannot give up on, Thomas Bryant, who has always been an intriguing player whenever he's healthy, Daniel Gafford, who I've made a video about, or mentioned him at least in a list, talking about him as one of the more underrated players in the Eastern Conference at the 5 spot. And you combine all that to look at a Washington team that perennially just does not have a ton of depth, a ton of versatility. They've always been a top-heavy team, but now they've got a ton of different options in a really, really interesting group. And the thing that should make you most excited, if you're a Washington fan that is hoping to retain Bradley Beal, is that number at the bottom of this in the 2023 offseason, where it says that they have $60 million committed to the 2023 offseason. Now, that doesn't mean that they have $60 million in salary cap space, because you have to account for the Beal extension and some other things, but they're going to have some room to make some moves, assuming Bradley Beal is still on the roster in the 2023 offseason, which is still a pretty big assumption in my opinion. But the way that they've managed to maneuver and change some things around with this roster is honestly incredible, and I give the new front office a ton of credit, because it does seem like if Washington would figure it out and create a playoff team, Bradley Beal would prefer to stay there. I've just always been of the opinion of that's fine, but he would also like to get paid, 1, and 2, he's not going to want to miss the playoffs every year for the rest of his career, even if it does mean that he gets to be a franchise cornerstone in Washington. So they always had to start to create a situation that would be conducive towards him at least making the playoffs on a consistent basis. And it seems like they've done that. Whether that's this year or not, or they're a play-in team, or whatever the case may be, it's about creating something that Bradley Beal can look at and say, there's a future to this. There's something on the horizon. There's something for me to look forward to that isn't just winning 30 games every year. And the promise of that future might just be enough to get Bradley Beal to stay. But recent NBA history tells us that that's just not the case. That's not how these things typically work. If you have a top 20 player in the NBA and you're not making the playoffs on a consistent basis, recent NBA history tells us that you are on the clock for that player. And typically, that clock has gone well past this point for Bradley Beal in Washington. And as we go into this season, things do start to get much more complicated as it relates to his own contract. Obviously, he has a player option for this offseason to become a 2022 free agent if he'd like to. But the extension negotiations and possibilities here for Bradley Beal are interesting and complicated as well. Because financially for him, the way that he can get the most money out of this is to wait until the 2022 offseason and sign either with Washington or with a new team outright. He can technically sign an extension right now, but it would not give him the same amount of financial incentive to do so. He would make much more money if he waited until the 2022 offseason, which creates a very difficult situation for Washington, because if you're going to be committing to building the roster this way, the way that they have over the last couple of seasons, you'd like to know that Bradley Beal will be a part of that roster. And the ideal situation for Washington has always been they put something together that looks like this, and then Beal says, you know what, I want to stay. I don't want this hanging over the team. Let me go ahead and sign the extension, even though he would be giving up money to do so on the open market. It's unlikely, in my opinion, that that scenario occurs, and that probably we're going to be going into a situation where Bradley Beal is looking at becoming a 2022 free agent. Now, as the title of this video indicates, the trade stuff is always a possibility for Bradley Beal. If the Wizards don't start the season well, if we get to the trade deadline and they're not really in contention for a play-in spot, it's just going to be a very anxious situation in Washington, because they're going to be looking at it thinking, okay, not only are we not good with Bradley Beal, but we're staring down the possibility of losing him for nothing in free agency. Maybe they start to waver on their commitment to retaining Bradley Beal or to keeping him beyond that trade deadline because of the possibility of losing him for nothing. And then Beal starts to look at the situation and say, yeah, the future looks kind of nice, but do I want to spend a whole nother year winning 20, 25 games and not really being in contention for a play-in spot? So the closer and closer we get to the trade deadline without Beal signing an extension and without the Wizards proving that they are a competent potential play-in team, the weirder and weirder this situation gets. Because not only does it make you nervous if you're a Washington fan that Beal could leave for nothing, but also the closer we get to that trade deadline, in certain ways, the value of Beal decreases, because the team that is trading for Beal has to get assurances from him that he will re-sign with that team. That limits the list, and that still would make the team trading for him nervous that it is possibly a rental and he could leave that offseason after giving up significant assets. So there's a lot to go into this for Washington. And even though from a roster building standpoint, they've done a fantastic job, and it looks more likely now than it did 2 years ago or a year ago that he would stay in Washington, I still am of the mindset that unless Washington is a surprisingly competent team and is hovering around that 7th, 8th seed at the time of the trade deadline, those trade possibilities are still very much going to exist. It's going to be hanging over this team, and I wouldn't be surprised if Beal asks out, or if the Wizards get cold feet on wanting to wait until the 2022 offseason with their fingers crossed that Beal would stay. If that scenario occurs and we get to the trade deadline or close to it, and it seems like a Beal trade is a possibility, there's some interesting scenarios around the league that I think could invite a Bradley Beal trade. The first one off the top of my head is a team that's been contending in the West. They haven't quite been able to break through, and it's the Denver Nuggets. It seems a little bit weird because Jamal Murray is hurt, and you know it's just going to be a weird season for them. They've got Jokic. I know that they love Michael Porter Jr. 100%. But if you're really, truly trying to contend and you think that Jamal Murray is going to come back well, I wouldn't be surprised to see them explore some type of trade there. And I think if it did get to the deadline this upcoming season, you wouldn't have to involve someone like Jamal Murray in the trade. I think you could do MPJ and some stuff, and maybe it's a 3-team deal and work in a Bradley Beal trade that way. I still continue to think that Dallas would be a team as well that would be interested in bringing in Beal. Certainly a team that has never been shy when it comes to making big moves and taking big swings. If Kristaps Porzingis regains some of his value as a trade asset, he could certainly be involved, and we could see a Luka and Bradley Beal combination there. And I still think that whether it be via a trade or him leaving in the offseason, I'm still about 70% sure that Bradley Beal is not going to be out on the Wizards roster next year when we begin the season. Granted, that percentage has decreased. They have done about as good a job as you could have asked them to do when it comes to, at least with this new front office, building a roster that Bradley Beal could see himself being a part of and seeing him, kind of competing for the playoffs with. But they didn't start in a very strong position in the first place, so even as good of a job as they've done, that doesn't mean they're necessarily in a good spot right now. So it's going to continue to be a thing, is basically what I'm saying, whether it be the extension stuff, his name being thrown around in trade rumors, the possibility of him going to Golden State or Denver or Dallas or any of those different teams. The Bradley Beal trade stuff is not over until he signs some kind of extension with this team, which he's done before. A couple years ago, he signed a surprise extension. Everybody thought he was going to be a free agent, and he wasn't. And I believe Beal that he does like to be in Washington. He wants to be the franchise cornerstone. He wants to be the guy. It's that Damian Lillard type thing where he just feels committed to the team and he likes being the number one guy. He doesn't want to go somewhere else and play second fiddle to someone else, right? Be Robin to someone's Batman. But still, at a certain point, when you're Beal and you're 28 and you're 29 and you're scoring 30 points a game every year, but your team is not even close to competing for the postseason, at some point, those thoughts have to start creeping in of, I need a different team. And if it does happen, it's going to be another storyline of what's going to be a crazy, crazy season. So among all the Ben Simmons stuff and some of the Lillard stuff we talked about this offseason, the Bradley Beal trade stuff, in my opinion, is absolutely still alive, and I'll be keeping a close eye on this team in terms of how they look at the beginning of the year, because if they are good, that pushes off the Beal stuff, at least for a little while longer. But that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you guys very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on the screen, check out my socials at the top of the screen as well, and yeah, hope you guys have an awesome rest of your Monday, and I will see you all next time.